Okay. Hello, everyone, once again. This is Carrie Kirk-Flew. I'm the Director of Local Government Assistance here at the DEP. And welcome to our 2022 virtual Harmful Algal Bloom Summit. I believe this is our second virtual gathering. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker this morning, who will give welcoming remarks, and that is our Associate Commissioner of Science and Policy, Katie Angerone. Katie has been with the department for 20 years and has touched on many projects and efforts throughout the department, including development of New Jersey's state land use policies, including stormwater management, habitat protection, flood hazard area controls, and protection of the Highline region. I'm very pleased to turn it over now to Katie for welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Carrie. Good morning. I am so excited to welcome you all to the second virtual, but third annual HAB Summit, where we exchange our stories about what works, what doesn't, new science, new technology, etc. I love this summit. It's such a great opportunity to keep us all current and connected and to share our lessons learned. And at DEP, we are glad to continue to host these annually as challenges undoubtedly change and with climate change certainly grow. So last year, our focus was on in-lake mitigation of HABs, but this year we're turning our attention to prevention. This approach of managing your watershed to address problems before they cause or exacerbate HABs is consistent with our work in the Department of realigning ourselves for more effective watershed management. Now, we've been sort of quiet on that front for some time, but you should not mistake our silence for inertia. In fact, the very opposite is true. We have been intently inventorying all of the functions in the water and watershed programs that support watershed management so that we could evaluate them to ensure that we're connecting all the dots. We are working to optimize how we improve water quality. And we have a wealth of data that we need to share both internally and externally in order to understand stressors and to select effective remedies and policies. So today, you're going to hear about some of those useful tools, and you'll hear about tools that take a comprehensive approach like watershed protection and restoration planning, and about total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, which tell us the amount of nutrients and pollution our waterways are receiving and from what sources. And these help us figure out how to put our water bodies on a nutrient and pollution diet to improve water quality. So you'll also hear from speakers outside of New Jersey because HABs, sadly, are a shared experience across the nation, and we are all seeing them amplified by climate change. We'll hear from scientists from Utah, our keynote speaker, in fact, and Florida, to discuss how they are addressing HABs, from federal partners at USGS, on a really neat project about how cyanotoxins and cyanobacteria travel through watersheds and surface waters, and from NASA on the use of satellite data to detect and quantify cyanobacteria algal blooms. And you'll have the opportunity to chat with our commissioner, who is very enthusiastic about water quality, so I hope you stay tuned for that. And finally, we will bring it home to New Jersey when we are joined with our HAB expert team to talk about the do's and don'ts of HAB prevention and mitigation, as well as experts from within the DEP and the Watershed Institute to discuss ways to prevent harmful algal blooms. And you'll hear a little bit also about the science of climate change and how intense precipitation will be increasing as our climate changes, and how this new science relates to the work that we need to do to maintain and improve our water quality by managing stormwater runoff. And we all understand after 2019 how costly HABs can be to a community. With that understanding, it's a little easier to invest in prevention. But as we get further away from 2019, it's important that we continue to remember the value of that investment and the cost of inaction. And given the state of the science, that climate change impacts such as increasing temperatures, shifting ecosystems, and more intense rainfall are in our future, investing in prevention is even more critical than ever. So as we discuss a more holistic approach to HAB management, with the backdrop of a changing climate, I would ask you to keep the following in mind. These aren't easy problems. They were long in the making, so the solutions aren't easy either. But it's worth remembering that there are real costs to our communities and that they are already incurring them, from HABs, from substantial and even nuisance flooding that interrupts businesses or causes dangerous mold to grow, for example. The good news is that most of the solutions we're going to talk about today address far more than just HABs. They address flooding, environmental health issues, including vector-borne and water quality-related illness. And we do know that taking bold action to mitigate climate risk is smart for your community. And as per Moody's, it's credit positive. So lastly, I'd ask you to remember that water does not abide political boundaries. We know this all too well. And climate change is the biggest threat to our communities and our economy of our time. Big problems need big shared solutions. So why go it alone? Genuinely consider regional or cooperative action. Explore partnerships with upstream and downstream municipalities, and even public-private partnerships. We've already seen some great successes with these approaches in the world of HABs and stormwater management. As awful as climate change is, we're all going through it together, so we might as well leverage that. Finally, I do want to remind folks that there is funding available. From time to time, we have Water Restoration Grant or 319 funding that you can tap into, and we are hard at work pulling together the lakes management funding opportunity that many of you are eager to see. So stay tuned as we expect to see that opportunity released in a week or so. And don't forget that the Water Bank has $17 million in principal forgiveness funding available in the current state fiscal year for water quality restoration projects that address HABs. And we expect that the Water Bank will continue to make significant funding and principal forgiveness available for these projects next year. So with that, I will get ready to hand it back over to Carrie, who many of you know has emceed all 3 of these HAB summits, and moreover, has spent a career here at DEP. May I ask you to please mute?
And use code this is 16.
Uh-oh. Thank you. So Carrie has spent a career here at DEP protecting the environment and helping municipal officials navigate the labyrinth that is state government. I'd be remiss if I didn't give us all an opportunity to honor her service to the state of New Jersey as she's hanging up her civil service hat later this month. Carrie, you've been an inspiration to me, a champion for our water and watersheds, and a gift to those outside the department. New Jersey is better because you chose to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. That means the world to me, for you to say that. And now I need to collect myself and talk to you a little bit about how we're going to move throughout the day today. We're going to have 2 sessions broken up by lunch. And when you come back, we ask you to use the same link. We're trying to make our sessions as interactive as possible. So at the end of each of the sections, there will be opportunities for question and answer. And if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see a little bubble and a hand. If you would like to have your question answered immediately, please raise your hand. If you would like to put your question in the chat, we'll try to get to them if there's time. If not, we will respond to them and post answers to those questions on our website. Just reminding you that we are recording today's session. So if you have to step away for any length of time, or if you would like to come back and review what was discussed, it is being recorded and will be posted after the session on our website. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Ben Holcomb. Ben is the manager for water quality and standards and technical services at Utah Department of Environmental Quality. He's worked in Utah for 13 years, and his past work includes salmon restoration, water quality management, and tribal sovereignty in the Pacific Northwest. He received a BS in environmental science from Allegheny College in Pennsylvania and MS in aquatic ecology from South Dakota State University, and he's going to talk to us from kind of the national perspective. Ben, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So it's my honor and privilege to join you all. This is a great experience. I know you guys are in great hands with Rob and Vic, and not just because, yeah, I think we have a good program in Utah. I think we hit above our weight class. And I know you guys have a great program in New Jersey as well. So I'm really honored for this. Although Utah has different challenges than New Jersey, I think you'll be surprised to learn how much we have in common. So if you're not familiar with the Mountain West, this picture here that you see on the opening slide might surprise you to see how much green we do have, water we have, and yes, where there's water or once was water, there's potentially cyanobacteria blooms. Next. And then if I suspect many of you though have this view of the West, and you're correct. There's considerable area of a xeric ecoregion throughout Utah, in particular the sagebrush habitat. But this habitat is quickly changing, which I'll get to in a moment. Next. So a little background context, just this map of the U.S. of the 30-year precip across the nation. And if you hone in on Utah there, you notice there's mostly brown to orange, lots of low precipitation areas. And then we've got the spine of the state, as you can see, the green lines that run north to south. Those are the mountainous regions. And then there's another segment that runs east to west in the northeast corner. And that's primarily where we get the bulk of our precipitation. And if you kind of keep that image in your mind, you'll see how some of this plays out in the next few slides. But yes, we're the second driest state in the U.S. Majority of the state receives less than 12 inches of precip a year. And so, yeah, that's the challenge right from the beginning. Next slide. And then here's the third habitat that you may not have considered associated with Utah, and that's urbanization. The land use here is changing dramatically. It's changing from that sagebrush habitat that I showed you earlier to houses. Utah's been the fastest growing state in the last 10 years. So from 2010 to 2020, we've experienced 18% growth. It's quite phenomenal. So perhaps we're trying to be like New Jersey. I'm not sure. But one thing we do have in common with New Jersey is that Utah, and this might come as a surprise to many of you, is that Utah is one of the most urbanized states. 90% of the population lives on 1% of the land, which is pretty remarkable to think about. So that poses both, challenges, but also opportunities in that regard. Also, we have the youngest population, many of whom like to get out and recreate in our limited water bodies. Next slide. So I'll refer to this figure throughout the presentation. I like to think of this as kind of our three-pronged approach for harmful algal bloom management, the prevention side of things that this summit is going to focus on mostly, the mitigation aspects, and that's our role as placing advisories to protect the public, and then the intervention or the treatment strategies that I suspect was covered last year. Next. So I'm going to focus on the next few slides with mitigation, just to give us around the state tour of different HAB events throughout the state. So here's a map of our program activities, and we can't cover the entire state. And so we rely on partners, although we do try to manage to cover the state as much as we can. We have one office in the state, and that's the star there in Salt Lake City. So just to give you some context, from our office in the state down to actually where I'm sitting today in that southwest corner, the blue dot down there, that's St. George area. That takes like 5-hour drive. So it's a considerable distance to cover. So we can't cover the state on on any weekly basis. We try to go to regions, stay there for a few days, and then go to another region. But you can see again how our sites run mostly north to south in the mountainous areas. And then also notice on the figure on the right how this is a chart of the incidents that we receive through our spill line, which is used as kind of our call-in center for whenever anyone from the public or other stakeholders notice HABs outside beyond what we're already monitoring. Those increase through time. And I see that as a good thing. I see that as, I use that kind of as our social indicator that our outreach and education is working. The public is becoming informed and knowing a bit more about their surroundings. Next slide. So I want to start off with Utah Lake and a few of the monitoring tools that we take. So the tools that we have are no more sophisticated than any other state. We may have the luxury to use more satellite imagery than other states due to we have more sunny skies than the east, for example. So we have a bit more satellite coverage. Our water bodies tend to be larger, so the satellite interpolations work a little better, and so that's definitely been a benefit to us. So this here is Utah Lake, and it's like the 4th largest lake in the West, and it's a real challenge. To give you some context, you want to hit next for me, please? So here's a little bit of a size comparison. This bay of Utah Lake is about the same size as Lake Hopatcong, which I understand is New Jersey's largest lake. So just to give you some spatial context of how large this lake is, it's a beast to cover, and it's right next to an urban area, so it enjoys lots of recreational uses. It's the most loved water body because of that, but it's also the most despised water body because of its water quality conditions. And so, yeah, we use a number of these different tools. We've got 3 water quality buoys out on this lake to help us try to better capture and represent different samples in the lake. Next slide. Yeah, and here's an illustration of the water quality buoys. We use phycocyanin or pH to give us an indication of when events are occurring out in the open water. We do take weekly samples out there, but these kind of fill in the gaps when we're not available. Next slide. And just to give you a little bit more context about how quickly things can change out on that lake, here's a series of satellite interpolations that span only 1 week. And you can notice that, July 28th, we had, spotty coverage of cyanobacteria. A few days later, it looks like, it's encircling the lake a little more. And then on August 5th, it's fully engulfed with a systemic bloom. And so these things happen really quickly. We have to be able to respond to these things as quickly as we can. And we use every tool that we have in our toolbox to be able to address these conditions and make sure that the public is aware of those. Next. And then this is Scofield Reservoir, and this is a high mountain lake. It's about 8,000 feet elevation, and it's used as a source of drinking water for the city of Price. And it's a considerably sized city, and it routinely gets these cyanobacteria blooms. I think it has historically, but I think the bloom that probably hit home the hardest for this community was when there was an extensive fish kill, there was a bat kill and bird mortalities. So the picture there on the left is some fish, and there's probably some bats you can see there along the shoreline. And then the picture on the right is their drinking water intake. That's about 20 miles downstream. And even though it's a considerable amount downstream, it still was taking in toxins. There were some really large quantities of toxins here. And this was kind of early on in our HAB program. And if there's one way to really get the public's attention about how important this issue is, it's to, demonstrate that mammals are dying from drinking their source water for drinking water. Next slide. And then here's kind of our third case study. It's on the North Fork of the Virgin River in Zion National Park. And this was a different type of bloom for us. This was a benthic bloom in the river. This occurred in 2020. Not only do benthic blooms provide their own unique challenges, but this water body in particular has multiple uses. It's a drinking water source. It gets high amounts of recreation. It's a global destination. And so we're dealing with populations that aren't just, American. These are from all over the world that come to visit Zion National Park. And so it's a real challenge to communicate these issues or these risks to, this set of population. Next slide. Yeah, as I mentioned, it has the multiple uses on this water body. So we had to work with the city downstream. This was triggered because of a dog dying on the river. And there's also agricultural uses downstream, and that just poses different challenges, particularly with the life cycle of benthic cyanobacteria, which I'll get to in a second. Next slide. So here's a picture of Zion National Park. If you look down below, you can see the Virgin River as it winds through the valley. Next slide. And in this river in particular were these benthic cyanobacteria. I don't know if they don't show up so well, but they can be these kind of hanging curtains along the side of the bank or attached to more stable substrate. And what happens is that, there's children or pets that play along the river, and these mats will float up and are basically like vessels of toxins that are very mobile. Next slide. And then here's just a kind of probably a better drawing to help illustrate that. As you can see that, you have the benthic mats growing on the bottom. They can easily be disturbed and dislodged, or just through their life cycle, they will eventually have detachment, and then they'll float up to the surface. And then from there, they're just at the whims of the currents and can move around. They pose a risk for livestock downstream who may be just eating this. Particularly dogs love to just play with these things and bite them. That's what happened in this instance. And so, and then there's, the place where we're trying to avoid that risk is for kids to be playing with these as well. And so these tend to have super high levels of antitoxin A or variants of antitoxin A. And so we're not seeing a lot of toxin in the water body because these antitoxin A variants tend to degrade rather quickly, but when they're intracellular, they seem to hold their longevity a bit longer. Next slide. And so another sampling method that we used to assist us with another line of evidence because of the difficulty of measuring benthic blooms is we use spat bags. So these solid phase absorption toxin tracking bags which have a resin inside, and they have this you can deploy them for 10 to 14 days or so. And it's not an apples to apples comparison with a concentration. This is a weight of toxin per weight of resin. But if you notice here on the graph below, we deployed these, longitudinally along the river, and it gave us a kind of a good understanding of potentially where hotspots were along the river and where we should focus more of our attention, at least longitudinally on the river. And so they were really helpful that way. And we still deploy these probably quarterly in the system. And, we're picking up toxins in the winter, times where we wouldn't have anticipated that. We still have, tremendous amounts of visitation in the winter. And so it's basically a year-round monitoring activity there. Next slide. So I guess I failed to mention that I've worked with both Rob and Vic on the ITRC project for the past couple of years. And then this recent last year, we've updated our ITRC guidance to include benthic mats and how they can best be addressed through different monitoring techniques, different communication techniques. And so this is kind of a screenshot of our updated website. It should be live here potentially next week. It's very close to being released. And so I'd love to be able to go over that with you guys, but not quite yet. Next slide. And then here's kind of another second social indicator that I look to is our poison control results. And so the public, they know to call into our poison control line if they feel that they've got symptoms associated with being exposed to a cyanobacteria bloom. And you'll notice in 2016, when we started this, we had a tremendous amount of cases. This was due in large part to a large bloom on Utah Lake. And so I more or less look at this as, our cases are dropping instead of like, but generally the adverse effects or those who called with kind of plausible symptoms or more likely associated with being exposed, those have also dropped. The caveat is the last few years that we did have some increases, and that's largely due to that benthic bloom down at Zion National Park. In fact, over 50% of the cases were due to Zion's bloom event. So, that's a different challenge with, educating that community. It's a tourist community that comes in and out, and just the challenge of communicating a benthic bloom, because it's, it's in clear water. It's a different paradigm to communicate that, and that's the challenge in itself. Next slide. So let's move on to some preventative approaches. I wanted to focus on this just a little bit, just because it was a theme of your summit today. Next slide. So yeah, just click through here. So we wanted to back up just one, if you don't mind. So we take we have 5 different elements to our nutrient reduction program. We first implemented headwater numeric nutrient criteria across all of our mountainous areas, which you see here in green. So all of those have a tiered approach to numeric nutrient criteria. Please visit our website. We've got our approach laid out there. It was a challenging project, but we're really satisfied with where we're at on that. The implementation of this program is leading us to lean more towards like the alt Tmdl approach, or the straight to implementation approach. And I think that's been a real benefit with our relationship with our Department of Ag and Food, and with our agricultural producers in general. And so so far it's started off really well. Next slide, or next bullet. Next, we implemented a statewide tech-based phosphorus effluent limits. We noticed that, with a growing population, our effluent limits of phosphorus were only going to continue. And so we kind of reset the clock a bit by requiring that all facilities at least meet this tech-based phosphorus limit. And the majority of them aren't just going to hit one, they're going to go beyond that. That's what we've found so far, was just getting this out in front of them, letting them know that this is something that's coming. Most of them have updated or in the process of updating their systems to be lower than 1. Next. And another large project we're doing is developing site-specific nutrient criteria for priority waters. In particular, we're deep into the numeric nutrient criteria development on Utah Lake, which has been a super huge effort. Next. And then we're also implementing stormwater retention and LID requirements throughout our urban areas. And this is a map here of our Tmdls. Next. Yeah, I want to just cover, here's where we've done Tmdls, and what follows that are typically non-point source project implementation. Next. And I just want to cover again, just how complicated developing numeric nutrient criteria can be. I don't know your efforts on some of these, but there's a lot of moving parts. There's, the science and the stakeholders and potentially the politics. And so, it takes a tremendous amount of time and resources to develop these programs. Next. But there's been some kind of really cool, interesting projects that have come out of developing these numeric nutrient criteria. For example, here's just some work that we've been involved with. The map or the image on the left is, sediment cores of the lake, the different phosphorus levels within the lake, which is overlain with satellite imagery, and then the interpolation of that imagery, and just being able to kind of line up, understanding where sources of nutrients are and how well that lines up with where we're seeing blooms originate. And it just helps us get a leg up on trying to wrap our arms around the complexity of the problem. Next. And then here's another throwback with ITRC. We put together an easy to use graphic to be able to kind of find the different on the ground non-point source or nutrient reduction techniques all in one space. Next. And then finally, I want to just touch on some intervention or treatment techniques that we've been touching on. Next. So here's Utah Lake. It's a really super large system. As you see there in the inset, that's just one of the 5 main marinas. And you can see the scale of the boats there on the image on the right. The size of this lake is not compatible with, in my mind, it would be billions of dollars perhaps of some treatment technique to apply lake-wide. So we're using the lake also as a way to experiment, and so we're mostly focusing on treating the marinas, which are pretty large, tens of acres large, and so we've been working with some contractors to use different treatment types. The challenge has been, how long can the treatment last? Because the water from the open parts of the lake begin to intrude back into the marina. And so treatments can last from anywhere from a day to up to a week. And so, but we've also used another technique. Next slide. Oh, yeah, I just forgot to mention that, over the course of the last couple of years, we've been conducting these treatments. They range anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 an acre. And then next slide. I guess my slides are a little out of order. Just wanted to demonstrate that we've also deployed these bubble curtains across the marina entrances to help mitigate or minimize the amount of influence between the open water and the marina. And so far that appears to be another useful technique. Next slide. And then just an update on our ITRC tools. We have updated our management criteria tools. This is the tool that kind of covers all of the different strategies that have been identified and peer review to have substantial information, or the different levels of potential treatment types. We have updated the tool to also consider treatment of benthic cyanobacteria. The spoiler alert is there aren't a lot of options when it comes to treating benthic blooms. Next slide. And then here's just an example of a fact sheet. Next slide. So I want to quickly go over some challenges. Particularly, we have increasing temperature throughout the state. We have more and hotter days. Next slide. Here we compiled satellite imagery across 30 years using Landsat. Next slide. And here's our other challenge, these high elevation and remote lakes. We have thousands of these lakes up in the mountains. Next slide. And many of them are having issues. And so the trouble is with how to communicate this. We can't be everywhere all the time. And so I think just our broad education and outreach to the public is where we're trying to spend our moments on that. Next. And then drought has been a significant issue. This is historic in the terms of it's been over 1,000 years since we've had a drought like this. And that's been determined by using tree rings of all things. This is what's particularly led to we're having a record low on the Great Salt Lake. We're not receiving the monsoon flushes on the Virgin River. That's where the benthic blooms occurred. And so that's, it's compounding the problems. Next slide. And so, yeah, here's a picture of Zion National Park. We've got the benthic blooms. Here's, an image of the boy and his dog, the dog that passed away. The water looks good, but there are dangers lurking in there. Next. And then how do we address that? These benthic blooms with an increasing recreating public throughout the state. Here's a picture of Capitol Reef where we've identified blooms. Next. And then also Grand Staircase, Escalante, like beautiful places, but there's potentially dangers lurking around. Next. And then here's my final slide. It's just basically some thoughts, like how we define success as agencies, as scientists. How do we communicate these realities with the public, the challenges that we face, for example, and then how do we balance that safety versus the fear, the fear of going in the water versus just being safe. I really don't have any takeaways for the scientific approach because I've always been confident in what we can do as scientists, but I'm always kind of concerned about whether we're communicating that appropriately with the public. And then finally, just rhetorically, how do we define and achieve resiliency with all these challenges that we're facing? And thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. That was very instructive. And while it's a sad relationship, it's good to know we're not in this alone, that we have some shared experiences, and hopefully our collaboration will continue to help us come up with good solutions. With that, we'd like to move into what's happening here in New Jersey and trying to address the governor's initiative on dealing with harmful algal blooms. First up will be Larry Torick, who is a research scientist in the Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration. Larry's been with us for 33 years. He's worked in the Natural Heritage Program and Endangered and Non-Game Species Program, the Bureau of Freshwater Wetlands, and the Division of Land Use Management. And today he's going to be talking to us about funding available to prevent and mitigate HABs. Larry?
Morning all. I guess hopefully everyone can hear me and my equipment's working correctly. Today I'm going to give us sort of a pretty brief outline on what our problems are with HABs, why we're making funding available, what funding we have distributed in the past, and where we're going with another round of funding received for this year. Next slide. Just as some background, New Jersey's released its first harmful algal bloom response strategy in 2017, recognized that various water bodies in New Jersey were suffering from declining water quality issues, and these were threatening public health and the recreational and conservation attributes of our lakes. Again, in November of 2019, Governor Murphy announced a HAB initiative to comprehensively address these blooms in the state. The initiative was focused on basically three main components, which were to reduce and prevent harmful algal blooms, to enhance the HAB science, and build monitoring, testing, and data management capacities to improve our efforts to resolve this issue and improve communication amongst affected entities. Yet despite all these issues, we still have seemingly having a continuing spread of HABs in New Jersey. As you can see, our 2020 data suggests that there was an increase of 26% of HAB warnings since 2019. And it appears that some of these issues on lakes are becoming chronic, with 54% of the water bodies confirmed with HABs in 2020 having a history dating back to 2017. Next slide. What are the leading causes of HABs? Primarily, some of the major ones are nutrient loading from runoff from impervious surfaces and agricultural lands, nutrient loading directly from stormwater basins and discharges from existing development and impervious surfaces, failing septic systems, and the characteristics of the lake and the sediment loading that it experiences are also a factor. Next slide. Previously funded actions. So in 2019, we had made a lot of funds available to try to address and research some of our issues with HABs in New Jersey. Approximately $2.5 million in grants were dedicated for HAB research. These projects are ongoing, so we haven't got the full return of these efforts yet. An additional $1 million was made available for planning projects that could reduce non-point source pollution, including nutrients and that contribute to the harmful algal blooms. And we also made $10 million available in grants to help resolve sewer and stormwater issues through upgrades to reduce nutrient flows into those water bodies. Next slide. So here we are, 2022. We have funding for Lake Stormwater Management Grant Program. The funding source for this money was the American Rescue Plan, and also they were delegated from funds through the state fiscal recovery funds. And we have a total of $10 million to work with for this year. Next slide. The delegation of these funds, the Senate and Senate Bill 316 provided guidance on the use of these funds, and they discussed using them for public access lake stormwater management grants, calling out some of our larger lakes, Greenwood Lake and Hepatcon Lake, and other qualifying lake management entities to really address the broad scope of this issue in New Jersey. Next slide. So as we move forward into developing an RFP for the use of these funds, we are weighing a large number of categories of types of projects to call out for funding. If you look at today's agenda, I think you'll see that many of the ideas that we're kicking around are going to be discussed, and they all appear, or many of them appear, to be major contributing factors to the HAB problems experienced by our water bodies. Next slide. So a couple ideas being kicked around are major planning ideas. Our lakes are all in kind of various stages of attacking their HAB problems. So a couple of ideas are proposals that would develop lake management plans for a project for lakes that perhaps have a problem but haven't fully diagnosed it yet. Another proposal could conceivably look at stormwater and non-point source pollution plans, looking at the watershed of the lakes, targeting, identifying where we have runoff issues, where we have point discharges, and trying to identify those to provide a basis upon which to move forward with more directed treatment for that particular lake. Next slide. Another aspect is green infrastructure projects within the lake watersheds. These are practices that have been implemented under many of our previous water quality and non-point source pollution grants, so they seem to be pretty effective. Next slide. Another category is retrofitting basins. We've seen a history of stormwater management across New Jersey where we had no stormwater management in it. Then we started with basins, but some of these basins were designed really to only solely handle water volume and not look at any sort of water quality measures. So retrofitting older basins that may have low flow channels that can shoot stormwater directly through it without any water quality treatment is an avenue that can be specifically used to improve water quality, and perhaps we can also integrate some of the potential threats of climate change and increased runoff to retrofit some of these basins also. Next slide. Throughout watersheds, non-point source pollution is often a factor of flow across landscapes that don't really have any functional riparian zones, or into wetlands that don't have any functional wetland transition areas. So improving situations where we can increase levels of vegetation and provide more ability to remove nutrients and stop sediments within the transition areas of our streams and wetlands would be a beneficial direction to look into. Next slide. We've also, as I indicated earlier, we've funded research and monitoring projects out there. That equipment, as with any equipment, has lifespans or needs to be maintained. Providing an opportunity to use some of these funds to upkeep the ongoing projects that we have and make sure the equipment continues to function and collect the data needed to move us forward in analyzing and solving these problems seems like a direction of potential funding. Next slide. Some lakes have issues with coves and other characteristics associated with siltation loading or just the bathymetry of the lake itself. Dredging projects may be an opportunity to address some of these problems where these are issues contributing to the lake's declining water quality. Next slide. Another thought is that many of these lakes have old residences around them. They have old septics, failing septics, can contribute nutrients and other water quality affecting aspects to the water quality of the lake. So making some funds available to perhaps upgrade certain areas with the sewer line seems to be a category that could help address some of these issues on lakes that have this as an issue. Next. And another thought is that we have plenty of we have recreational opportunities to lakes. Some of these recreational access areas are old. They were built years ago. They weren't designed to try to address water quality issues. So the opportunity may also exist to provide funding to replace some of our access areas and to our lakes in a way that will help improve water quality. Next slide. So the legislation that was prepared by the New Jersey Senate to address lakes management, stormwater management funding, did call out certain criteria for potential establishment of the global area of people who would be available for funding. The legislature looked at Greenwood Lake, Lake Apacon. These are two of our biggest lakes. These are lakes that are experiencing significant HAB problems. They're also areas of recreational use. So they were identified, spread, broadening out the local government units to address lakes across the state. Many of these lakes, or a good number of these lakes, may have local lake commissions, which would also be available for funding. And then the nonprofit organizations were also identified as folks or groups who the legislature intended to make funding available to. Next slide. So the way our funding is currently looked at, it's $10 million that we have received from the federal government. This is money that we would make available, or considering making available, across the spectrum of categories once we define them through our final RFP. This funding is to be spent. So we will accept applications and distribute this money until this money is gone. The funding comes with a timeline and an expiration date. The funds have to be encumbered by December 31st of 2024, and they have to be expended by December 31st of 2026. Next slide. The release of, and so the final thing I want to touch on is right now our RFP is being finalized. As Katie had indicated earlier, we anticipate it coming out in a week or two. So once this is available, funds will be available, and we can begin to accept projects that will begin to help us further address these issues in New Jersey. That's it.
Thank you, Larry. So moving on, our next speaker is Nathaniel Sadak. Nathaniel has been the watershed director of the Wallkill River Watershed Management Group for the past 21 years. They operate under the auspices of the Sussex County Municipal Utilities Authority. The group prides itself as a local watershed liaison capable of connecting diverse community partners with conservation organizations throughout the state to ensure water quality, restoration, and improvement projects. I would be remiss if I did not point out that Nathaniel also was among our first class of New Jersey AmeriCorps watershed ambassadors in 2000 to 2001. So we feel like Nathaniel is very much part of the DEP also. Nathaniel will be talking about the importance of a watershed protection and restoration plan. And Nathaniel, you're up.
Good morning, Carrie. Thank you very much for that introduction. I do want to add, Jessica, I'm confused at the moment because I cannot see the video screen or the slides. I can hear everything. I can see myself, but for some reason, the share feature, I am not able to see the PowerPoint slides. In the middle of Larry's presentation, halfway through, all of a sudden the slides stopped moving or advancing, at least on my screen. So I apologize for this, and I wonder if there's anything that can be done to help me here with this particular issue.
Jess, are you able to address that?
Let me stop sharing and I will.
I'm really not. I wish I knew what was going on. It was working fine, and oh, there we go.
Good.
Yes.
Nathaniel, you can see it? Okay.
All right, let me get, if you don't mind, let me just get a little reacclimated here, because if you can imagine, I was like a little concerned there about what was going on, but thank you very much. All right, problem solved, and hopefully we'll have no trouble advancing the slides here. Carrie, once again, thank you for that introduction. I I love to talk about the fact that I was in that first class of AmeriCorps New Jersey Watershed Ambassadors, and that's something that is near and dear to my heart. I'd also like to just quickly say that listening to Ben this morning, I quickly was thinking, man, I should change my my shirt for this presentation and put on my favorite T-shirt, which says that I walked the narrows of the Virgin River in Zion National Park a few years ago. And I can tell you that, you know, for my family and I, that was one of the most amazing experiences of our lives. And Ben, I think you'll appreciate knowing that we took the local advice and got up and started that hike at 5 o'clock in the morning. So when we walked that river, it looked nothing like the picture you showed. And instead, we pretty much had it to ourselves. So it was pretty neat to be able to hear that this morning. Moving forward, I am incredibly thankful and grateful for the opportunity to be here today and to provide this presentation and speak to all of you. I am incredibly proud to have been involved in watershed restoration planning and protection work in New Jersey over the course of the past 22 years. So as part of my efforts to provide this presentation today, you know, I had to take a little trip down memory lane. I had to backtrack a little bit. So once upon a time, as I put on this slide, or back in March of 2000 to be exact, our organization, the Sussex County Municipal Utilities Authority, was awarded one of those initial planning grants in the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to jumpstart watershed planning up here in the northern area of Sussex County. Next slide, please. Some of you may remember this historic map. You know, when that initial planning effort was jump-started across the entire state, this map was used to identify the 20 local watershed management areas across the entire state. And for our organization, the SCMUA, WMA02, or the northern corner of the Wallkill River watershed, was our area of work and expertise. So what were we trying to do? We were looking to get people involved. We jump-started those education and outreach programs to get the people not just in the meeting room, but out into the field. Not only getting them into the field, but giving them opportunities to get their hands dirty, their feet wet. Next slide, please. And that was what we referred to as our community stewardship program. After the community stewardship program was initiated, we developed 3 primary programs. An agricultural outreach and assistance program allowed us, utilizing DEP funding, to work in partnership with USDA and NRCS, work with the local farmers, build relationships with those farmers, and ultimately put Ag BMP projects on the ground designed to improve water quality as well as the operations on the farm. We've established a riparian ecosystem enhancement program. This program has allowed us to work with partners across the area and plant tens of thousands of trees along our stream corridors with the goal of providing a reforestation that improves water quality, as well as improving the health and ecosystem function of these riparian corridors. We've been able to jumpstart a green infrastructure program where we're providing education and outreach to the local communities to help them understand the importance of stormwater management, and then to put projects on the ground that seek to actually manage that stormwater. And over the course of these 22 years, I think what I'm most proud of is it's not just about the Wallkill watershed for us anymore. Our efforts have allowed us to expand across all of Sussex County and be recognized as a watershed liaison that is here to help throughout this entire area of northern New Jersey. But when I was thinking about, you know, speaking today, and as I said, taking that little trip down memory lane, what I really realized is that the foundation for our success and all that we've achieved has been the efforts of our organization to build and develop watershed restoration and protection plans. And in 2008, using 319 funding from the Department of Environmental Protection, we successfully completed the development of 2 separate sub-watershed plans, one for the Papicating Creek and one for Clove Acres Lake and the Clove Brook watershed. Both of these sub-watersheds of the Wallkill watershed were identified as key areas of concern, and we built plans for them as such. Next slide. And in 2012, we were able to do it again, but this time outside of the boundaries of the Wallkill watershed and into the area of the Upper Paulnscale watershed, or part of WMA01, the Upper Delaware watershed. And in 2012, this plan was completed, submitted to DEP, and finalized. And that sets the table for where we're going today with this presentation. So what is a watershed restoration and protection plan? Well, by definition, as you see here on the screen, it's a watershed-based plan that addresses water quality problems in a holistic manner by fully assessing the contributing causes and sources of pollution, then prioritizing restoration and protection strategies to address these problems. Now, it's very important to understand that a watershed restoration plan is designed to be built upon a scientific background or utilizing all kinds of scientific methods and practices. But watershed planning is not an exact science. Next slide. Now let's jump into what is actually meant by a watershed restoration plan. Now, by definition, both by the United States Environmental Protection Agency and as required by DEP, it contains nine minimum elements. Next slide, please. Let's look at these elements for a few minutes. So the first step, and obviously the one that makes the most sense, is to identify the sources of pollution. What's causing the pollution? Now, I think over the years that I've been involved in watershed restoration and protection work, it's been, I would love to say that it's people have developed a much greater understanding that it's non-point source pollution that is the area of concern. And Larry spoke about that in his presentation. It's developing a better understanding of what the pollutants are on the land that are being washed into our surface waters through stormwater. Those non-point source pollutants, or what we love to speak to the students about in the school as people pollution, are what we're trying to target. Once we identify those causes and sources of pollution, it's about estimating those pollutant loadings to the watershed. And where can we expect to try and reduce those loads to the watershed? Obviously, this work is often accomplished through modeling. Once we have these estimates established, it's time to start thinking about the various management measures, or everyone's favorite phrase, best management practices that can be put on the ground to help achieve these load reductions. Once those practices are identified, what are the necessary financial resources? What are the technical resources? And who are the partners that are needed to help make this work? Next slide, please. None of this can be accomplished without successful education and outreach. And implementing an education outreach plan, as I spoke about in the beginning of the process, or in the beginning of this presentation, is the key to getting the process off the ground and moving in the right direction. This is not something that can be accomplished in one office room. You need to work with the stakeholders who are out there, bring them into the effort. You then look to develop a project schedule. How are you going to go about this? You're not going to build this plan overnight. As part of building the plan, you need to set measurable goals and milestones. Again, I said you can't accomplish it in one night, but you want to give yourself some goals to achieve that are going to help you feel that sense of accomplishment, that help you realize you're making progress. You also want to identify and establish indicators and parameters that help you measure your progress and success. It's not just about being able to say that everything works. You sometimes have to think about what's not working so you can reassess how you're going about building that plan. And then when all is said and done, as part of the plan, you want to make sure you have a post-monitoring plan. This allows you to kind of assess how things went, how things worked or didn't work, and then ultimately allows you to get lessons learned that you can build upon in the future. Next slide, please. I have always loved, when I'm speaking to the community and talking about what a watershed restoration plan is, to talk to them about building the story of the watershed. It's about helping them realize they have a role in developing the story. Next. To do so, you need to get out there into the watershed. You need to find those areas of concern. You need to look, where are those flooding concerns that are occurring with each storm? Where are they getting worse? Helping people, realize, there are locations that would need to be targeted. Understanding where the impervious surfaces are. The areas of loading to our watersheds off of impervious surfaces can be significant. Studying the diversity of land uses and their different impacts to the watershed are important. Adjusting the activities or the way we go about working on our lands. And ultimately studying the watershed within the entire boundary. It's not just about one location here or there. It's about understanding all of the locations, all of the land uses, and how they are related to one another. That's how you develop that watershed restoration plan. And that's how you start to develop the story of what's going on in the watershed. Next slide, please. To help build the plan, you need to understand what's going on and what the water quality data is telling us. And this can be in the form of historic data. It can be in the form of currently being collected data. It can be in the form of chemical data, biological data, and visual data. What do we see out there in the watershed? All of this data needs to be collected and assessed to help us understand what's going on in the watershed. Next slide. You need to find out what's important to the local watershed residents and stakeholders. And that's the key to the education and outreach approach. To these watershed residents, those are the ones that are living in the area. Those are the ones that are recreating in the area, working in the area. What are their key concerns? Next slide. It's also about finding out who is in the watershed that wants to help, who can help, who are the partners, who are the people that can bring resources to the table to help build this plan and ultimately implement the projects that are identified. Next slide. So how can watershed residents and stakeholders help? Well, most obvious is that they can help bring concerns and problems to the planning table. A lot of times these residents have been in the watershed for a long time and have access to historical information and data that is incredibly valuable. They can ultimately get involved in those implementation efforts once they're identified. After getting involved in these efforts, they often work to help promote the stewardship of the watershed. And most importantly, stakeholders and local residents help spread the word. Next slide. When you think about the nuts and bolts of building the plan, it's that research component that's critical. What resources are already available? Reviewing municipal plans or parcel maps, stormwater management plans, speaking to the municipalities about what ordinances are already in place. That research process is a critical step. Studying and assessing the water quality data, like I said on a previous slide, any type of data can be valuable to help you understand where is the watershed being impacted in a way that we need to address. The education outreach initiatives are critical, identifying those partners and resources, seeking out the low-hanging fruit or the projects of opportunity that are going to be quick to be able to get on the ground once the resources are available. That's a key process for developing this restoration plan. Next slide. So why am I coming back to the slide that I started this entire presentation with? I was asked today to speak to the idea of why these watershed protection and restoration plans are important. And as part of my efforts to think about what I was going to speak to you about today, it helped me realize that it's the foundation for success that these watershed plans establish that is critical. And they allow you to be ready when the time is right. Next slide. So I'm going to share a story with you. I'm going to give you an example of how the development of a watershed restoration plan can be incredibly powerful when that time is right and the resources come to the table. In 2013, the William Penn Foundation launched the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. And this was a major collaborative effort bringing together partners from across all 4 states of the Delaware watershed, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, in an effort to take watershed planning and restoration work to the next level. Next slide. Because of the funding that the Department of Environmental Protection had provided us to build that watershed restoration plan for the Pollutants watershed, when the DRWI was initiated, the New Jersey Highlands cluster was identified as one of the key areas to be focused on. And within that New Jersey Highlands cluster was the Upper Pollutants watershed. Next slide. Because of the watershed restoration plan that we had in place, we were invited to sit at the planning table with a host of local organizations and other conservation partners that we really had not had the opportunity to work with in the past. Since we were a small organization, sitting at the table with these partners was incredibly valuable to us and opened up all kinds of new doors. By opening these doors, and our involvement with many of the governmental partners like the Department of Environmental Protection, a whole new mechanism for leveraging resources and bringing funding together was identified. And as a result of bringing those leveraged resources together, all of a sudden projects that were identified in the watershed restoration plan became a reality, and putting them on the ground became the next step. Next slide. As a perfect example, here's an aerial view of Mcewen School and Hampton Township. This was an area that was identified in one of our watershed restoration plans where project opportunities were identified for stormwater management with the Pollutants River being directly across the street. And in 2016, the Mcewen School Rain Garden was born. In 2019, the Mcewen School Porous Parking Lot was born. And with the success that was put on the ground at Mcewen School, the story started to spread. We moved next to the neighboring town of Newton and Memory Park. And in 2018, the Memory Park Rain Garden was born. Working together with the town of Newton DPW, we then expanded to all of the Newton public schools. And I'm proud to say that as of today, projects have been put on the ground at the Newton Middle School, the Newton High School, as well as neighboring Sussex County Community College. And coming next month, we'll put a new project on the ground at the elementary school. The success that we experienced at Mcewen School and in the town of Newton was generating a lot of attention and was opening doors to work with all kinds of new partners in the Pollutants watershed. A perfect example of that is the Greater Culver Lake Watershed Conservation Foundation. This is an example of a partner that came to us because they heard more about what was going on and they wanted to do something within their lake community. So we sat down with the Greater Culver Lake Watershed Foundation and started discussing what we could do at Culver Lake. So what came next? Here is the Culver Lake or the Normanok Association Clubhouse, and an opportunity unfolded to build a rain garden front and center at their most visible public location in the entire lake community. And I am proud to say I saw earlier in the morning, I saw Paul Sutphin is a participant in the summit here today. And I believe he's probably still on this summit and he's listening as we speak. Paul is a perfect example of how you can engage a local stakeholder, a local partner through the watershed planning process to help make something happen. He is a key champion for the efforts that have evolved here at Culver Lake. But the efforts didn't stop at Culver Lake, because once we had this rain garden on the ground, the neighbors down the street wanted one as well. So literally we crossed the road down to Kemo Lake and built a rain garden right adjacent to their local pavilion in Front Beach area. Next slide. So with these demonstration projects on the ground in these local lake communities, the neighbors wanted to learn more. And we've jump-started efforts to help these local neighbors, the homeowners, do their own work on their own properties. And working with Rutgers Cooperative Extension, we've started implementing training sessions, which they've done all across the state, but we're doing it up here with them now in these Pollutants Lake areas, as well as beyond those boundaries into the rest of Sussex County to teach homeowners what they can do on their own properties. Next slide. In the past couple of years, the pandemic may have slowed us down a little bit with respect to how we could go about things, but at the same time, it didn't have to stop momentum. And we found other ways to spread the word, to share information, to make sure that efforts were still in place now that we're coming out of it, that we can start putting more projects on the ground. Next slide. So where has this put us today? As a result of all this effort in the Pollutants watershed, we now have what's called the Pollutants Lakes Initiative. Those rain gardens jump-started something special. You know, the first rain garden at Culver Lake, the next rain garden at Kemo Lake. And we now have a Pollutants Lakes Initiative that was born as a result of funding from the William Penn Foundation and the DRWI, but now has expanded even further. Next slide, please. Here's a perfect example of how we have come full circle. In 2012, the DEP funding allowed us to build that watershed restoration plan, to build a foundation for future work. In 2013, I told you how the William Penn Foundation's DRWI was born. That brought more funding to the table that helped us start putting projects on the ground. And utilizing all of that, here we are in 2019, and we have been able to successfully secure a new water quality restoration grant from the department that's going to help expand the Pollutants Lakes Initiative. This is exactly how we can go about preventing HABs in our lake communities. And I am also incredibly proud to say that we were identified and asked to be a partner with the Swartzwood Lakes Association to help them build a watershed restoration and management plan for their lake, to repeat a very similar process that we utilized to build the restoration plan for the Pollutants, that has led to 10 years of valuable watershed restoration work. The doors have been opened to really make a difference in our lake communities here in Sussex County as a result of these initiatives and funding opportunities. Next slide. When we step back and think about it, we could go back to those slides and we can address those 9 minimum elements one by one. And they are the key components of building that restoration plan. But at the same time, when I think about it, here are some of the critical keys to success that I want to leave you all with today. That effective integration of science and planning. As I said earlier in the presentation, the watershed planning is not an exact science. Science is critical to make it work, but we need to adapt as we move along. Keeping open lines of communication to promote strong teamwork. Leveraging the resources and funding. Landowner engagement and building those partnerships is a critical key. Empowering the local community. To me, that is one of the most important components. All of us on this call today, a lot of us are involved in this watershed planning and restoration work on a daily basis. But it's when we get the other members of our community involved that our ability to make something happen becomes even greater. Harness those projects of opportunity, or I called them low-hanging fruit earlier in the presentation. One demonstration project can lead to so many more, as I tried to show with my story. And then ultimately, we need to build upon those lessons learned and the project's success stories. That will springboard us into a future where we can truly make a difference. And as we are talking about here today, we're looking at preventing HABs, not just responding to them, but finding successful strategies, methods, projects that are going to allow us to turn the tide on this and make sure that the problems we experienced in the past can be prevented. In closing, when I was asked to give this presentation today, it did allow me to spend some time reflecting. And I am incredibly grateful for the 22 years that I've been involved in the state of New Jersey with this line of work. It's all about partnership work. And I've had the opportunity to work with so many of you that are listening right now, that are participating in this summit today. And I truly look forward to the opportunity to continue working with so many of you more as we continue down the road on this journey together. We're all in this for the same thing. And by working together, we can truly achieve great results here in the state of New Jersey. Thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to interacting with you throughout the rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Wonderful. Our next speaker is Kimberly Ceno. She is the Bureau Chief in DEP's Division of Water Monitoring and Standards. She's been with the department for over 32 years and is a graduate of Douglas College. She holds a bachelor's in geology, and it earned her master's degree in city and regional planning from Rutgers. Kim is going to be talking today about total maximum daily loads in New Jersey lakes. Kim, take it away.
Hi, thank you for having me. So pleased to be following Nathaniel, one of our early partners in the Watershed days and back when we started doing Tmdls. And my presentation as well had me looking back a little bit along the lines of history of what we've been doing with Tmdls in New Jersey. And Tmdls, total maximum daily loads to address eutrophic lakes, topic of my talk today. And Tmdls, next slide, is another tool in our toolbox in order to address HABs. Next slide. So what are Tmdls? Tmdls provide the regulatory framework to specify the reductions needed to attain surface water quality standards, and they take into consideration what are the point sources of the pollutants. We call this the waste load allocation. What are the non-point sources of the pollutants or the load allocation? A margin of safety, which allows for any unanticipated actions, and a reserve capacity in order to allow for growth. So that is the definition of Tmdls. And they are a calculated pollution budget report. It includes a general implementation plan that has the measures necessary to be employed to mitigate the sources of non-point source pollution. And then we address the point sources of the pollution through permitting process through our NJDEP permits. And so the Tmdls are an effective tool to address our Clean Water Act goals, and it's a large part of our initiative to reduce and address and prevent algal blooms from happening in the future. Next slide, please. I don't think the slides are advancing on my screen. I still see the what is Tmdl slide.
Okay. Hold on. We'll stop sharing. We'll stop sharing and reshare.
Thank you.
I have a pollutant of concern up on my end.
Yes, that's the next slide.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
So the pollutant of concern in our lake Tmdls that we've done is phosphorus. It's the nutrient responsible for the over-fertilization of inland lakes that leads to the eutrophication. It's the mechanism that causes the use impairment for excessive primary productivity. And the symptoms of eutrophication are oxygen supersaturation during the day, oxygen depletion at night. This gives us a diurnal DO cycle of the highs and the lows with the DO, a high sedimentation rate, and the loss of biodiversity. Next slide, please. So in New Jersey, we, as many states, have developed freshwater lake criteria through our surface water quality standards. And our standard for lakes, ponds, and reservoirs for total phosphorus is 0.05 milligrams per liter, unless we develop site-specific standards for a water body. And our criteria also has a narrative portion to the criteria. Except as due to natural conditions, nutrients shall not be allowed in concentrations that cause objectionable algal densities, nuisance aquatic vegetation, or otherwise render the waters unsuitable. So it's a two-part definition for numeric criteria and a narrative criteria. Next slide. So how do we know if our water bodies are impaired? Well, we have to collect a lot of data in order for that to happen. And you heard about Nathaniel talking about the data collection at the local level as well. So we gathered the data to make a determination if we're meeting our water quality standards, physical, chemical, biological, and including that visual data. And we have different networks, or chemical, macroinvertebrate, fish tissue networks. The department collects data. USGS under contract to the department collects data. And our partners collect data as well. And in fact, we've revamped our community water monitoring program in order to help complement and have additional data sets available to the department. Next slide. And what do we do with all this data that we collect? Well, we put it together as required by EPA in a biannual water quality integrated report. Most recently, we've completed our combined 2018-2020 water quality integrated report. It was approved by EPA, and we're just waiting to have final adoption of that report in the next month or so. It's available on our website, and it now went from a 700-page hard copy report to a visually web-based report with a story map. And speaking of watersheds, we look at our water bodies based on a very small scale. And we have 958 sub-watersheds in New Jersey based on this HUC 14 scale. And our most recent report, we've looked at an incredible 3.8 million data samples. And just to give you perspective, back in 2006, we only had about 300,000 samples of data that we looked at. That's a 1,000-fold increase in the amount of data that we now have that we're making decisions on the water quality in New Jersey. We look at over 90 parameters. And if those water bodies are impaired, then we put them on the 303D list of impaired waters as required by EPA under the Clean Water Act. So our integrated report is basically our report card for New Jersey on the water quality health. And we report out on 7 possible designated uses. Next slide, please. And these designated uses are aquatic life general, aquatic life trout, water supply, recreation, primary and secondary, fish consumption, and shellfish. So we look at our water bodies, and this is again from our most recent report, to see if they're supporting this designated use, if they're not supporting the designated use, or if we have insufficient data. And as you can see on the slide, in the blue color, we do have some data sets that we need to have more comprehensive data on to fully make decisions. But as I said, we've come a long way in the past 10 years as far as having the data to make these decisions. Next slide, please. And our top 10 list of pollutants related to the particular designated uses show that we have our E. coli and our biological impairments, dissolved oxygen, temperature, so on and so forth. And then we also have arsenic on here. But for the most part, the arsenic is due to natural conditions from glauconitic soils that release arsenic into the waters. So while they impair our water supply, we still are meeting standards through our safe drinking water and the treatment technologies to the treatment plants. So this list of the pollutants and the integrated report is meant to be a snapshot of the 5 most recent years of data, and that we put this report out every 2 years related to the water quality health. Next slide. So in order to address those impairments, under the Clean Water Act, TMDLs are required to address water bodies that cannot meet surface water quality standards after the implementation of technology-based effluent limitations and/or secondary treatment. So we prepare these TMDLs for the impaired water bodies. Next slide. And in order to calculate TMDLs, we look at all that data that we've collected. And if we have enough data that we can do some simple models, we call them spreadsheet models, where we can basically do them at our desktop, and there's some mass balance equations that we can use. So those are simple models. We also do complex models. We did this in the Passaic and in the Raritan, where we had many dischargers, and we collected unique data and did unique modeling in order to predict the conditions in these basins. And we had load allocations and waste load allocations assigned out of that TMDL process. So those are dynamic water quality models. So that's more along the lines of complex models. Next slide, please. So the required components of a TMDL per federal guidance to the states is that you do a source assessment. You characterize and qualify and quantify as necessary the point, non-point source, and background levels. You do the water quality analysis. Again, you do your modeling, whether it be a simple or complex model, your TMDL calculations. You identify follow-up monitoring. You have implementation measures. And throughout the process, you have a public participation component. Next slide. So to address HABs through TMDLs, we already have completed over 600 TMDLs in the state, and the average TMDL requires about a 60% non-point source reduction. But unique to New Jersey, per our water quality management planning rules that address TMDLs, they are adopted as an amendment to one or more of the 12 area-wide water quality management plans. And our TMDLs require that we have a TMDL implementation plan. At the federal level, EPA likes states to have implementation plans, but it is not a required component as it is in New Jersey. And in addition, our rules state that the department shall not issue permits or approvals that conflict with adopted area-wide plans. So if the TMDLs and the TMDL implementation plans are adopted to the specific area-wide water quality management plan, the department shall not then issue permits that conflict with this. The implementation control actions that we've identified to date in our TMDLs along the lines of issuing the water quality-based permits. Those address our point sources through our NJDEP program. Then we've identified the need sometimes to do track down studies to further identify where the sources of the non-point source pollution are. We've funded many 319 non-point source restoration grants, and some of that includes those implementation and restoration and protection plans that you heard Nathaniel talk about previously. And some other things that we've considered in past Tmdls was having an additional measure through the MS4 stormwater permitting program. Next slide, please. In 2004, we did a series of lake Tmdls, and this was based on an earlier 303D list of impaired waters, the 2002 one, where we had listed Greenwood Lake, Lake Pakong, Mcewen, and Swartzwood Lake, among a host of other lakes, as impaired for eutrophication based on some EPA lake reports that were done as far back as the 1990s. At that time, we did over 30 lake Tmdls. They were approved by EPA in 2004, and we used a simple model called RECAL model to assess loadings from the different land uses. So how much non-point source was running off from the different land uses. We identified a target condition. As I spoke earlier, our 0.5 milligram per liter is our standard for surface water quality standards for lakes. But in order to address a margin of safety and in order to look at the steady state condition in our lakes, we established a more stringent target of 0.03 milligram per liter for total phosphorus for our lakes. So that was our target goal in all those Tmdls. The various Tmdls identified a range from 40 to 60% non-point source load reductions. Those lake Tmdls, for the most part, did not have point source discharges. There was a few schools in some of the lakes, and they were assigned a waste load allocation that basically required them to hold the current load from their processes. And so those Tmdls were really very non-point source driven. And the Tmdl implementation plan in those earlier Tmdls talked about developing lake characterization and restoration plans to identify in-lake measures needed to reduce the total phosphorus. We talked about implementing current 319 projects that were going on and the need for additional restoration measures and projects. And we also identified a phosphorus reduction ordinance at the local level as an additional measure in those Tmdls. So the Tmdls were implemented over these past almost 20 years in various degrees. Again, we developed many lake characterization and restoration plans. The department continued to fund 319 non-point source restoration projects. And in fact, the local ordinance that we required for phosphorus was then superseded by a statewide fertilizer law. So we have done quite a bit in the last 19 to 20 years for those lake Tmdls. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of, well, what a typical Tmdl report would look like, I just took some snapshots from some of these older reports to show you that there's some graphics and calculations and charts that are in tables that appear in these Tmdls. This one's particularly from the Lake Mcewen Tmdl, where we looked at and identified the load contribution that was running off over the land and into the water body. And so we broke it down by the different land uses and including a tributary load. So this is how you start building your Tmdl and ultimately identifying the reductions that are needed. Next slide, please. So here's a table from our Greenwood Lake Tmdl. And in this, we break it down in a much more specific level, as you can see in the slide. We had some septic systems in the water body at that time, and so we've identified a loading associated with each of those and what a required reduction would be. And in this case, we identified a 43% reduction needed in Greenwood Lake in order to address the impairment from the non-point source loading to address the 0.3 milligram per liter target for total phosphorus for the in-lake criterion. Next slide. So that brings us to today. So we wanted to re-look at these older TMDLs, and as part of the protection effort for the HABs initiative, we specifically wanted to look at the lakes where we were seeing the HABs problem, the Lake Hopatcong, Greenwood Lake, and Schwartzwood Lake. So using that same RECHAL model and the same analysis that we did that was approved by EPA in 2004, we wanted to take a look at updating these TMDLs. So we wanted to pull in the latest data, the latest land use coverages, and redo these calculations. So staff are busy at work doing this analysis as we speak. But more specifically, because we have that requirement in New Jersey to have a TMDL implementation plan, we want to write much stronger and much more detailed TMDL implementation plans in these revised lake TMDLs. And we think that this is a great opportunity to really get at the sources of the non-point source pollutant and the runoff that's bringing the pollutants into the water body that are, in some cases, the potential causes of the HABs. So that is our primary purpose in revising these lake TMDLs. Next slide. So in these revised TMDLs, the TMDL implementation plans, we wanted to have, as I was saying, a bit more specificity. So some of the things that we'd like to consider that we will then be stakeholdering in the local lake sheds is things like an adoption of a revised stormwater control ordinance for new development and redevelopment, expanded stormwater facility mapping, inspection, and maintenance program, establishing a schedule to retrofit basins to address water quality based on the results of this mapping, looking at any illicit connections, identifying them, and then of course eliminating them. And then some of these water bodies have manufactured treatment devices in the lake sheds where the local communities have received grant funding from the department and from EPA directly to put in these mechanical treatment devices. And so the operation and maintenance of those devices are very important. So we wanted to map them, have the GPS coordinates of them, and have annual maintenance agreements in place so that they continue to work as a best management practice to mitigate non-point source pollution. And also, if the training hasn't been completed at the local level, for there to be the completion of the stormwater training that is offered by the department. Next slide. Additional things for consideration in the TMDL implementation plan is developing a septic system licensing program that tracks the pump out of the system tanks every 3 years and the inspections needed, to explore emerging technologies to treat phosphorus in these on-site wastewater treatment systems, to evaluate the merits of connecting properties with on-site wastewater treatment systems to, if an available treatment plant, develop in more detail or revise some of the older lake restoration plans. So these lake plans, as we learned from Nathaniel, really hone in on hot spots, and those hot spots are perfect for the nutrient source control. So some of the older restoration plans predated the EPA guidance on doing a 9-element plan. So going back and revising some of those plans may be ideal in order to identify those hotspots and sources of the loading and identify the appropriate best management practices in those plans. And again, those plans being then ideal for funding mechanisms, both from the department and through the synergies, as we saw in the example from Nathaniel, the great success that they've had in their watershed. And then to ensure the implementation of the statewide fertilizer ordinance and possibly developing impervious cover reduction plans. They do this in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's something we could look at here in New Jersey, pulling that into our lake TMDL implementation plans and having less impervious cover so that the pollutants can not run off the land and into the water body. So these are some of the ideas that we're considering. Next slide. And so the next steps as far as doing updated and revised lake TMDLs is, as I was saying, we're doing the calculations in-house, and then we want to stakeholder this at the local level. So today is a little bit of a preview of what that would be, and to give you some ideas of where we'll be going and what the conversations are that we want to have at the local level to have these more tighter TMDL implementation plans. And then the TMDLs will be revised and they will be subject to public comment. And then after the public comment process, they will be adopted to the appropriate water quality management plan. And as I said, once they're adopted, when the department issues its permits, they should be in alignment with what the TMDL says. They shouldn't be contradicting one another. So we think that this is a great approach, another tool in our toolbox, if you will, in order to address HABs in our lakes in New Jersey. And we look forward to having this as part of our stakeholder process. And I want to thank my team, led by Ms. Yazo Sivaganish as my section chief, and my team lead for TMDLs, Ms. Helen Pang, and the rest of the folks in our bureau, Frank, Einon, Crystal, Debbie, Brian, for their work that they do on the integrated report and for TMDLs. It's truly a team effort here in the department, and then it will be as we continue to work with locals in order to address the HABs in the lakes in New Jersey. And so thank you for letting me talk about TMDLs with you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Kim. Moving right along, our final speaker in this section, final speakers are Dr. Fred Lubnow and Dr. Mayan Wu. Dr. Lubnow is the Director of Aquatic Programs at Princeton Hydro and the Office Manager of the Exton, Pennsylvania office. His area of expertise includes the identification of algal and zooplankton and management of harmful algal blooms and their associated cyanotoxins, the design and implementation of in-lake management strategies, and the development of watershed-based management plans that focus on non-point source pollution. Dr. Lubnow is also one of the members of New Jersey's HAB expert team, who's conducting data reviews and assessments of our scientific literature on HABs in order to develop strategies on how to holistically address such conditions in freshwater systems. Dr. Wu is the director of the New Jersey Center for Water Science and Technology and professor of biology at Montclair State University. She's an ecosystem ecologist whose research focuses on water quality, aquatic ecology, harmful algal blooms, pollution, transport and control, and ecosystem restoration. I'm happy to turn it over to you, Dr. Wu and Dr. Lubnow.
Thank you, Carrie, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to represent the governor's harmful algal bloom and lake management expert team. Joining with Fred, we'll be sharing with you what the team has been working on. Next, please. The expert team was established to enhance the state's scientific expertise and to build the state's capacity for HAB response. This 10-member team is tasked to evaluate HAB prevention and mitigation strategies, review NJDEP's water quality data to identify trends and provide recommendations. To develop New Jersey's HABs and lake management guidance material, review progress and outcome of New Jersey HAB-related projects, and to provide assistance to local partners in the development of HAB action plans. Next slide, please. At today's presentation, Fred and I will first share with you the expert team's recommendations for the NJDEP's ongoing HAB monitoring program. Specifically, we will focus on the following three areas: vertical depth series, modeling relationships, Cyanobacteria community composition. In addition, we will also review the expert team's recommendations toward HAB-related water quality monitoring, HAB prevention, HAB mitigation, and management. Next, please. As you are all aware, in a lake, water temperature changes along with the water depths. As demonstrated by the top graph on the slide, it is color-coded from yellow to blue, representing water temperature from hot to cold. The deeper the water, the color is showing more blue or colder. This vertical profile is much more distinct during the warmer month or during the summer stratification, when water circulation and nutrient availability are limited to within each layer. In past years, HAB monitoring is often limited to surface water sampling only. Grab water samples were collected within the top 1 meter of water column. However, some cyanobacteria can actually move through the water column. They can do the vertical swimming up and down. They will move to the deeper water in order to obtain nutrient from the deeper water column when nutrients become limited at the top water column. And this will allow those cyanobacteria to outcompete other algae that does not have the ability to swim in the water column. So cyanobacteria is likely to become more dominant. The bottom graph is showing the phycocyanin reading in the lake, which is an indication of cyanobacterial density. It is also color-coded from yellow to blue, representing the higher to the lower cyanobacterial density. So the yellow and green are showing higher density, and the blue is showing lower density. As you can see on the graph, during the summer months, the top water column is more blue, and the cyanobacteria were concentrated at around 5 meter water depths. So when we only do the surface water sampling, the surface graph sample might provide inaccurate assessment of the hot condition in the lake. So the expert team recommends that future HAB monitoring should include water sample collection from multiple water depths to avoid this type of situation. This will provide a better tracking of the trophic state of a lake and facilitate the early detection of conditions likely to result in the development of a HAB. Thanks, please. The expert team uses the state's data set that have been collected so far and explore a relationship between HAB and environmental variables using various statistical methods. The goal is to identify environmental triggers of HAB events. The data demonstrated a positive relationship between cyanobacterial biomass and nutrient in the water, a positive relationship between microcystin and nutrients in the water. However, there is no strong relationship found between total cyanobacteria cell count and microcystins. With that, the expert team recommends that HAB biomass or cyanobacteria cell counts and cyanotoxin toxicity should be monitored concurrently. Only monitoring cyanobacteria cell count is not sufficient, as the two not necessarily have a positive relationship. HAB monitoring strategy should change from reactive to proactive monitoring. Routine HAB monitoring is recommended for the early detection of a potential HAB event. Additionally, nutrient reduction needs to be a priority for long-term HAB mitigation and management. Next, please. The expert team also studied cyanobacteria community composition. The data showed that HAB can continue into winter months, as demonstrated on the top graph. High cyanobacterial density continue into the winter months of December, January, and February. The expert team recommends that HAB monitoring to extend beyond the traditional summer and fall seasons, as well as to not only record cyanobacterial data, but also record the complete phytoplankton community data. Additionally, we found dominant cyanobacteria taxa vary from one lake to the other, also vary between seasons. On the bottom graph, Cyanobacteria taxa is color-coded, one color per taxa. During the winter month, you can find more blue on the chart, showing an aphanizomenon dominated lake. And during the summer month, the lake was dominated with Aphanocapsa, which is demonstrated with a color orange. So different cyanobacteria produce different cyanotoxin, and some cyanobacteria exhibit greater toxin producing potential than the other. So the expert team recommends that collecting data on the cyanotoxin producing gene as well. Next, please. So more about the HAB monitoring. The expert team recommends a monitoring program should include the current practices of phytoplankton and cyanobacteria identification and enumeration, the measurements of cyanotoxins, including microcystin, centrospermopsin, endotoxin A, and saxitoxin, as well as the previously recommended cyanotoxin producing gene. Additionally, the expert team recommends to include measurements of chlorophyll A, which is an indicator of total algal biomass, phycocyanin, an indicator of cyanobacterial biomass. And if the water serves as a drinking water source water, taste and odor compounds are also recommended. Next, please. HAB monitoring should also include other limnological parameters such as water temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, conductivity, Sacchi depth, turbidity, total suspended solids, pathogen indicator bacteria E. coli, and nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and silica. We also recommend monitoring the biological community, including zooplankton, macroinvertebrates, fish, and macrophytes. With that, I'm turning the presentation to Fred to discuss HAB prevention and mitigation. Fred?
Right. Thank you, Dr. Wu. Can everyone hear me? I just want to confirm. Okay, good. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to shift, as the outline said, into prevention. And definitely something when we talk about prevention to keep in mind is we are seeing the impacts of climate change, that it can make conditions more favorable for HABs. The higher water temperatures, droughts favoring more still water conditions. But then you can have other situations such as large storm events that may increase flushing, that may help to reduce HABs. So these swings in precipitation events and in climate can really have an impact on HABs. So, as has been discussed, the most effective strategy in preventing HABs is through nutrient control. And for cyanobacteria in particular, the focus should be on phosphorus. And when we're talking about nutrient control, obviously the large part of that is the external loading coming from stormwater, surface runoff, septic systems, source control, stabilization of eroded stream banks and shorelines. But internal loading can also be an important source of phosphorus as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just showing this. This is a 30-year database of surface water temperatures at Lake Apacon, mid-lake, in July, and we see a statistically significant increase in temperature, surface water summer temperature over that period of time. And it was just interesting hearing Ben earlier talking about Utah Lake, and I did a quick back of the envelope calculation, and about 35 Lake Apacons could fit into Lake Utah. And I remember years ago at the North American Lake Management Society giving a presentation on Lake Apacon, and some of the lake managers from the West and the upper Midwest were sort of chuckling how, quote, small Lake Apacon was compared to their lakes. And I said, yes, but there's about 500,000 people that recreate at that lake, live in the watershed, or visit the watershed. And that took them by surprise, that water body gets so much recreational use, and so many people live in the watershed. Next slide, please. So, over the last, I would say, 20 to 25 years, since the Lake Apacon Commission has been around, the Lake Apacon Commission has received funding and support from various organizations locally, from the 4 municipalities, the 2 counties, the state, federal agencies, and they've implemented a wide variety of stormwater, green infrastructure, as well as septic management programs. The Borough of Apacon and the Township of Jefferson have been implementing septic management measures. The Borough of Apacon has been focusing on sewering some of their sections. So there's been a lot of positive effort in reducing those nutrient concentrations. And this is just showing you that 30-year database of mean surface water TP concentrations at Lake Apacon. And indeed, we've seen a decline in the surface water concentrations, which is good. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, what we've also seen is when we look at the deep water concentrations of total phosphorus, during that same period of time, there's been an increase. And we did a pretty detailed statistical analysis. This increase is not only an increase in concentration, it's also an increase in the volume of anoxic water. And when I say anoxic, that means no dissolved oxygen. And in the absence of dissolved oxygen, the bond between iron and phosphorus is broken. And so that dissolved phosphorus leaches into the upper water. And as Dr. Wu mentioned, as it accumulates in those deeper waters, the cyanobacteria can then migrate through the water column and harvest that phosphorus-rich water. So we've seen an increase in the internal phosphorus load, and at least part of this is attributed to climate change based on the increasing volume of the anoxic zone. Next slide, please. So a few weeks ago, a bunch of us attended the Pennsylvania Lake Management Society. And if you're familiar with Ken Wagner, he's a well-known limnologist from New England. He was the keynote speaker, and he had this great analogy that I wanted to include here. He said watershed management is fixing the boat, but by the time you fix the boat, you may have water in the boat that you have to take care of. The water in the boat is the internal load. So in many of these situations, we have to focus both on the external and the internal load. And so your boat may have very little water in it, so you have to focus solely on the watershed, or your boat may have quite a bit of water in it. So you have to not only take care of the watershed, fix the boat, but you have to bail that water out. And I liked that analogy because it really depends on lake-specific conditions, whether or not you need to include internal phosphorus control in your management plan. Next slide, please. So I'm going to shift from this prevention, and there's a lot of great talks coming up about measures for prevention. And Nathaniel mentioned some great green infrastructure tools. I'm just going to now focus on what the HAB expert team has been focusing on, relative to mitigation and management. So we spent a considerable amount of time focusing on addressing these questions. In addition to that, we've developed a draft format. So DEP provided us with some questions and issues they wanted us to address. We did that. That material was then forwarded to DEP. As a matter of fact, earlier this week, we forwarded that document to them. So my understanding is the material will eventually be made available for general distribution after DEP's review. So, the team will have an opportunity to do a final draft, and then this resulting guidance document can be publicly reviewed and available for monitoring and the prevention and treatment of HABs. Next slide, please. And so I'll just throw some of the questions out that we've been addressing. So, what are the potential short and long-term impacts of both permitted products and non-permitted treatment products? So the permitted products tend to be the aquatic pesticides. So we provided some detailed information on the potential short and long-term negative impacts and positive impacts associated with the aquatic pesticides. And then we did discuss some of the non-permitted treatments, such as nutrient inactivation. And can a combination of these treatments result in negative impacts? In contrast, can a coordination of these applications result in a higher level of control? And, an example of this is whether or not, if you're going to do nutrient inactivation, if you already have a HAB, you really shouldn't do nutrient inactivation because it's not going to take care of that biomass. But if you did a treatment to get that HAB under control and then did nutrient inactivation, that may be a good solution. But again, it depends on the product you use. For example, alum does not bind with organic forms of phosphorus. So if you did a treatment of a copper product to kill that HAB off, and then you try to use alum to remove that phosphorus. If a lot of that phosphorus is in organic form because those cells lysed, it may not be effective. So those are some of the questions that we addressed in the review. We also talked about the timing of various products on the effect on both targeted and non-targeted organisms. And then if there are any upper limits. Now, I can say that, you know, the state and federal agencies have upper limits in terms of how much of a product you can add, either per volume or per surface area. But we were looking at how can you minimize the amount of product as possible, but still have a benefit. Next slide, please. And then also we looked at other issues such as aeration. You know, using an aeration system can be an effective way of increasing circulation, of disrupting that habitat that the Habs like to move up and down the water column, but it can also be very effective in activating that internal phosphorus load. And if you're focusing on internal phosphorus load, that aeration system really needs to be operating from basically spring through fall. But what are the impacts of that? For example, if you're destratifying a deep lake, you may eliminate carryover trout habitat. So that needs to be taken into consideration. The potential impacts of operating de-icers. So if a property owner is using a small bubbler around their dock just to prevent damage on their dock, that's one thing. But many of these de-icing systems are huge, and they're over-designed, and so now you have these huge openings that are not only a safety hazard if someone's trying to do recreational winter activities, but I've seen many lakes that have open water in the winter, and you see all the geese congregating there, and those geese are definitely a major source of phosphorus. So, you know, having these open waters over the winter can really increase your phosphorus load. And then how does weed harvesting control and or trigger HABs? And we've, you know, at Lake Capacon, we did a study about 15 years ago where we calculated how much phosphorus is removed through the mechanical weed harvesting, and then we translate that to how much algal biomass that would be. So, you know, it's important if you're doing harvesting, you're focusing obviously primarily on aquatic plants, but how does that impact any sort of potential HAB or reduce the potential of having a HAB? Should harvesting be timed to reduce the risk of nutrient buildup? And harvesting is very frequently used more for, you know, opening up habitat, recreational use, controlling invasive species, but can we take nutrient removal into consideration as well? And you don't want to over harvest. So for example, in a very small lake, if you're harvesting too much, you may actually favor the development of those benthic cyanobacteria, because if there's sunlight hitting the sediments and those plants are no longer there, the filamentous cyanobacteria may take over. And then finally, we're reviewing the potential impacts of drawdowns on algae in general and in HABs. A couple things I can mention is the team, as well as DEP and New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, all agree, you know, summer drawdowns are not a good idea. If you're drawing down during the summer, you're making more nutrients available, you're reducing the flushing rate of that water body, you can really have a negative impact and trigger a HAB. Winter drawdowns for plant control or working on docks or some type of mitigation measures are permittable. The thing is with them is you have to be careful in terms of when the water comes back up. And again, the state has some very stringent criteria on when you can start a drawdown and when you can end a drawdown. Where drawdowns, winter drawdowns have triggered HABs, it's usually in situations where if a lake had a complete elimination of the nearshore aquatic vegetation, that can actually trigger a HABs in the following season, because now that you have no plant biomass, that filamentous mat algae can take over. So we're looking at aspects associated with drawdown with that, as well as, you know, when you do a drawdown in the winter, you can actually consolidate the sediments, and that can actually help to reduce the amount of algal growth. But we've also found in some of those studies that in more eutrophic systems, if you have a lot of organic matter, that may contribute to the mobilization of phosphorus. So again, we're looking into all these aspects. We've finished this draft, submitted it to DEP, but I think the bottom line I do want to say is, you know, these situations are very lake specific. Just because one technique or management measure worked in one lake doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work on another. You really need to collect that site-specific data. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, you know, Kim mentioned this in terms of the Tmdl and some of the previous speakers as well. You certainly want to quantify the hydrologic and pollutant loads for your lake or reservoir. You want to quantify both the external and internal loading, not only on an annual basis, but on a monthly or a seasonal basis. Consider extreme weather events in your plan. You know, your lake may function very differently under a drought condition than a wet or normal water condition. In addition to a lake management plan or a watershed implementation plan, you may need a beach or near shore HAB management plan. And again, Ben, talking about Utah, how, you know, they have an overall they may have an overall watershed plan, but a lot of their in-lake techniques are focusing on those marina areas. You know, in New Jersey, you may need a similar thing where you have an overall watershed plan, but you may want a smaller plan to focus on a beach or a marina area. And then finally, you know, again, this has been mentioned, Nathaniel mentioned it, Kim mentioned it, you know, monitoring the health of your water body is important, not only just to document the existing conditions, but after you implement projects, you know, were those projects successful and to what degree? So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wu and Dr. Lubnow. That was great. And now we're going to have some open discussion. We're going to have it facilitated by our Commissioner, Sean Law-Tourette. He's got some questions for you, and I'm sure you might have some questions for him. I remind you that if you have questions or want to respond to the Commissioner, please raise your hand. And if you look at the upper part of your screen, the little happy face with the hand is where you would indicate your desire to speak. So without further ado, I am turning it over now to Commissioner Sean Law-Tourette. Commissioner.
Thank you for that, Kerry, and for all that you do. As I'm sure everybody here knows, Kerry will be leaving us soon, and we're pretty broken up about it. So thank you again for your many years of service, and particularly for the work you've done on lakes and facilitating this discussion and so many other important discussions over the course of your career here at DEP. So I thought I'd start by thanking first everyone who's gathered here today in order to discuss HAB related issues, catching the end of Dr. Lubnow's conversation there. Appreciate the work that you do, sir. And a huge shout out to Katie Angerone, our Associate Commissioner for Science and Policy, who has focused so much time and attention and the instrumentalities across DEP on this important issue. You know, one of the things that Katie has led in combination with so many across our team has been the release of a good amount of funding, millions of dollars to fund projects that prevent HABs throughout the state. And you know, we wanted to set aside some of this time as an opportunity here from those that have received funding or those still experiencing HABs to share successes and challenges, any recommendation for future efforts, and most importantly, how we can work to continue to partner with you to address HABs. So question, about what tools you think could be helpful. What is a success or a challenge that you want to ensure our awareness of or my awareness of? So, by all means, please raise a hand and feel free to contribute to the conversation. And Kerry, if you wouldn't mind helping to facilitate the hands that may be raised. I can't really see it in this setup.
Let's see, we have Bradley, Bradley Bastina. Go ahead, Brad.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So in part of the presentations this morning were the grants or focused on, I'm going to quote, I think it's right, publicly accessible lakes or publicly accessible waters. So I'm wondering when and what grants are going to be available for private lakes who may be the headwater of a watershed. My lake happens to be, I'll mention it if that's okay. It's called Lake Owassa. We feed into Culver Lake. Culver Lake feeds into the Pollutants, which eventually goes into the Delaware. So, so my question is, when will grants be available for private lakes that are not publicly accessible, but are impactful because they are the headwater of a very large watershed?
That's a good question that I'm happy, Bradley, to take back to our team and discuss with the folks here at DP. I apologize. Getting a call. But I don't know an answer to your question off the top of my head, but it's a worthy one. So I'm happy to take that on and bring it back to folks.
Great, thank you. If you'd like my contact information, you may be able to get that through publicly or privately, but I would be interested in your response to that.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Mike Francis, you have a hand up.
Yep, I do. I've got a question actually for Mr. Holcomb from Utah, and my question would be: has Utah? It looks like they're trying some pretty progressive technique with the HABs, and have they used any natural or biological treatments that are non-chemical for treating their HABs?
Ben, if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the question. To my knowledge, we haven't tried anything that are along those lines. We've been, we've been presented with some alternatives, such as like, microbial applications, and we're a little hesitant to just apply those to public waters. We'd like to see a little bit more evidence of their use. But I think there's some encouraging signs that there's just a lot of questions of when you start changing the microbial makeup of even a small area, what does that mean in a big scheme of things? So yeah, at this point, we've been mostly using peroxide treatments, which, the benefit with them is there is no residual once they're done. And then we've done limited copper treatments. And those are, those have their own limitations that we set on them. So.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Shyam, you have a hand up, please, for the commissioner. Can come off mute. No? Okay. Julia Summers.
Certainly. Commissioner, good afternoon. I just want to, first of all, thank the department. This has been an excellent presentation so far. You and your department should be proud of yourselves. And that the presentation has really emphasized the enormity of the problem. And we don't have a lot of money to go around to address the problem. That's an ongoing issue. Will the department, as you consider all the applications for grant funding and so on, weigh those considerations at all to favor applications where there are matches offered or other kinds of funding brought to addressing the issues, whether it's being through other grants or from other sources, in the case of private lakes, or local funding for private lakes, or for public lakes, from stormwater utilities or whatever? other sources, just to try and help the money go further?
It's a great question, Julia, and thank you for your participation here and for the kudos. They belong to the team, not to me. And one thing that I'll say is we're always looking for ways that we can stretch the almighty dollar. It's not unlike any issue around a boardroom table or a kitchen table, for that matter, where there is, in all spheres of the work we do, this very much included, much more need than there are resources. And so we have to look for all the ways that we can to leverage the resources that are available. And I'm very happy to hear you reference stormwater utilities. I've said before, and I'll say again here, that we stand ready to handsomely reward those with the will and political courage to take on that challenge, because it is a necessity. And so you'll hear more from DEP on that score in the weeks and months to come. We want to make resources available for folks to undertake that very, very important pursuit. And with respect to how we are able to utilize our clean water funds in pursuit of projects that will ultimately be beneficial for lake communities, we've tried to create the right amount of leveraging through our state revolving fund, for example, in order to help in those settings. And we'll continue to explore ways that we can make those opportunities more broadly available and help them to compound one another. It's tricky, but we absolutely want to do the most good for the most people.
Well, we certainly welcome you encouraging folks to do the right thing here, and rewarding those who do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Idala Hansen.
Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank the DEP for hosting this great HAB summit. I've been thoroughly enjoying it all morning. However, my question is for Dr. Love now. I'd just like to know what the mitigation and monitoring efforts, how are they going in Ashley Cove up in that part of the Lake Hopatcong region?
Sure, yeah. So over the last 2 years, we've implemented projects in Ashley Cove. So we did 3 things. And let me give a real quick history of Ashley Cove. We actually tried to do some stormwater management in that drainage area, but we were having a lot of issues because of utilities and right-of-ways and infrastructure. They did do some buffer planting around Ashley Cove. But then what we decided as part of the Habs restoration program is we implemented 3 things. 2 of them have been completed. The 3rd one will be completing this year. So the first was we installed some biochar, which is this processed burnt wood material, which has a high affinity to remove nutrients. We added the biochar into the cove. And then we did a series of treatments of Phoslock, which is a lanthanum-based nutrient inactivator. It strips the water column of phosphorus, and then it binds with the phosphorus in the sediment. Before we did the first treatment in 2020, we actually had to do a peroxide treatment to get the algae under control. So we did have to do that first. But after that, we didn't have to use any of the peroxides. We only did a series of Phoslock applications over the last 2 years. What we saw in Ashley Cove was it cleared up, but we had a lot of plant growth, which again, in these shallow systems, when you have clear water hitting the sediments, something's going to grow. It's going to be either plants or algae, but we definitely rather the plants, because the plants provide stabilization of the sediments. They provide habitat for fish and other aquatic life. They increase the biodiversity. They help to stabilize the nearshore areas. So yeah, aquatic plants can be a pain, and they may require some level of management and maintenance, but we would definitely rather the plants than the Habs, which produce the cyanotoxins and have all the other undesirable ecosystem effects. So And also just the final thing I'll say is we're wrapping up the final report for the HAB project for Lake Apacon. And for each one of the mitigation measures that were implemented, we're going to have a summary sheet for the public that will go through, what was the benefit, what were the limitations, what were the costs, so that, any lake user can use these fly sheets to make decisions whether or not they should consider one technique over the other.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Sadak, question for the commissioner.
Thank you, Carrie. Actually, what I thought would be appropriate to quickly respond to was the question and I guess discussion from Mr. Bradley Battistini a few minutes ago. It's funny, his question represents a perfect example of how valuable this summit or any education and outreach effort can be amongst all of us partners who are involved. Because his question is, he's looking for assistance, he's looking for guidance. And the reality is, as I spoke a little bit this morning about in my presentation, getting out there to the local community members is such a vital component of the work that we do. And Mr. Battistini, I'm proud to be able to tell you that, you are in the area of our Paul and Skill Lakes initiative. So some of the funding resources that we currently have available, through the Department of Environmental Protection, through the William Penn Foundation, you're right down the street from some of the work we've done at Culver Lake, at Kima Lake. And being able to now connect with you today as a result of this summit could lead to the next success story in our local watershed area. So, that being said, I want to commend you for participating in this summit today so that you can learn about some of the resources that are out there for your lake community. And all of us partners that work in this line of work who are on this call today are glad to be able to connect to you through something like this. So to answer your question, my group and I and the partners we work with locally will be happy to reach out to you or to have you reach out to us in the near future to get you involved in this line of work. And as I said, this summit and the opportunity to connect, communicate, share resources, share information, this is a perfect example of why it's so critical for us to share our stories and to reach out to one another. So thank you for your question, and I'll look forward to connecting with you. And maybe you'll down the road be sharing a success story at a future summit.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Marty Kane.
Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner, for this opportunity. And thanks to staff for it's a great dialogue today. It's great to see the $10 million that's about to be released that was, put forward last year by the legislature. And as someone like Fred Love now will attest to, there's so many issues that even if we did have stormwater utilities in effect, that would not be addressed by that type of funding, where you need additional types of funding to address the loads that's already in bodies of water. Would the commissioner really support this type of a continued funding? $10 million is not a large sum in a state of New Jersey's budget, but to address those areas that are unique to lakes that really would not be funded in any other manner.
Thanks, Marty. I think every little bit helps, right? Whether it's what we're able to generate from a stormwater utility and how you can force multiply that with other funds, including like the legislative addition that was made in last year's budget. Whether there's a continuing appropriation for lakes management in particular is, I wouldn't say above my pay grade. It's certainly parallel to it, right? We have a legislature that controls that purse, and I'm always happy to engage with our elected leaders on what is important in our view. And certainly there'll be opportunities to engage in that conversation with elected officials in the coming weeks as we go into our budget season with the legislature. And I imagine that there could be some questions about that during budget hearings, and I'm happy to address it.
Thank you very much.
Matthew Sis.
And thanks, Commissioner. I think, I'm going to be a little bit selfish coming from the water utility perspective. I feel with cyanotoxins in particular, we're at somewhat of an infancy stage with the library and maybe the quality of some of the data that we can develop. When I hear some of the other questions and some of the speakers, I'm feeling a little bit siloed, right? And I wonder, in your opinion, how, and I think DEP's done a tremendous job and developed some great online resources. Frankly, I'm a little out of my depth when I get too far down in the weeds sometimes. But, what is your vision for connecting the recreational use of our waters, the drinking water utilities, the source water perspective, the stormwater perspective? How do you see all these silos, and maybe we're here as step one, but how do you see those integrating to better our understanding of this connected system?
I think we could talk for hours about this, Matt. As the guy who just jumped in to find 1,4-dioxane in Delaware River, I don't know that when you talk about wading in over your head, I don't know that that's possible for you. And I'm sorry to have missed your testimony in person at the hearing the week before last, but I did listen to it afterward, and it was terrific. So thank you. Look, I think this is part of how we do that. But we've got to constantly remind the folks who are not in this space with us, who wouldn't know to know that this space exists, about the interconnected nature of our water resources, right? Because it is so very easily taken for granted, whether we're talking about what is recreational versus what is drinking water, or what washes up into our communities, right? And think about it from a flood risk perspective as well, where you've got a community that's repeatedly inundated and all they want is the water away from them. But just because it's away from them doesn't mean it ceases to exist, right? And there is so much education and outreach to further an appreciation of this interrelationship. So all the spaces that we can create and encourage participation in are critically important. One of the ways that we're looking to do that internally, and Katie Angerone can speak about this, and then external engagement grows out of it, but that how we create at DEP networked plans from a policy perspective that bring together the pieces of our watershed program that actually do live in different places within what can be siloed media programs at DEP, right? Drinking water systems, water supply, right? Geology, right? And then even when we talk about watershed and land management, there has to be a master structure atop that. It's Katie's whole job to facilitate, and how we then build out the tentacles externally to help folks appreciate that. I hit on it every opportunity I can when I'm with elected leaders, for example, that your drinking water problem, it's also your clean water problem. It's also your recreational problem. It's also your flooding problem, that these things don't exist unto themselves. We're happy to have partners in doing that.
Thank you, Matt. Marty, your hand is still up. Do you have a follow-up question, or is that just a remnant of the? Okay, I am
It is
not.
a remnant. I apologize. But I will ask, since you gave me the thing, I will ask, is there any possibility of getting a permanent or a lakes person point of contact at NJDEP as they had over a decade ago, so that we have one person that we can all annoy rather than shooting at all of you at once?
Do you feel as though you don't have one?
I feel that we actually annoy Kerry, we annoy Katie, we annoy members of your staff. And I also think a lot of times our elected officials aren't sure who to reach out to on any given point. So I do think there is some merit to a single point of contact on staff that everybody knows is the lakes guru.
Yeah, and just this is going to show my age, but I would say a good 20 years. This is Fred Lubno. A good 20 years ago, there was a person by the name of Bud Can. He was the point person for lakes in New Jersey. And when he retired, there was never a replacement. And I got to commend DEP staff. I mean, they've been phenomenal and they've taken HABs very seriously. But I think to Marty's point is to have someone to talk about lake issues that aren't just HAB oriented, but maybe, you know, someone who is familiar more, you know, with lakes in general, invasive species, you know, some of the issues associated with permitting, some updated technologies. But I certainly don't want to take away from the team that you have. They've been absolutely phenomenal in terms of being very proactive when it comes to HABs, and the science is just great. It's stellar. So.
And in fact, I think we sometimes abuse your staff too much because they have been really great to work with. You know, we wax poetic about members of your staff, and we are going to miss Kerry incredibly when she moves on. But, you know, a lot of times now I feel like sometimes we throw too many questions at the same people, and they may not be the right people.
Well, you can rely on my office, of which Katie is a part, to facilitate always making sure that you do have the right people. And sometimes there is no one person, and that can be a really good thing. Because what we want to ensure is that we're connecting all the pieces that necessarily have a home in a particular, whether it's bureau, whether it's within a media program, whether that one person who knows all doesn't really exist, right? So what we have to make sure of is that there is an appreciation and a routing that is central, and we'll continue to work on that for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, I'm not seeing any other hands up. Is there anyone out there who has a question or a comment, a suggestion, as the commissioner had indicated he's interested in hearing on any of the needs within the lakes communities? Okay, seeing none. Commissioner, oh, we have one. Donna McCauley-Holly. You're muted, Donna.
Hi, everyone. It's Donna from the Lake Apacon Foundation. Good to see you, Carrie. Commissioner, and Katie, I just have a question, regarding your HAB expert team. They've been very helpful in, identifying issues of concern in that. What is the plan for them going forward? Are they going to continue to operate? Are they going to be disbanded? What is DEP's next step for that?
Katie, would you like to address that?
I sure can. I think, Donna, we do have a contract. I can't recall with perfect clarity what the end date is, but I think we're open to, a continued conversation about understanding what a resource they've been for you. So if we find that they're a good resource, then we'll talk about continuing that contract. I'm not quite sure we're there yet. I think we just got them up and running, so I'm not thinking that we're worried about that contract closing yet. But your feedback is always welcome, and I personally love the fact that we have them and we can send charged questions to them, because some of these questions are really thorny. And as the commissioner said, a task force is often better than an expert.
Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. Alessandra Rossi, your hand was up and then it went down. Do you have a question?
Sorry, my question was for Kimberly Ceno, actually. So I put it also in the chat, so she can answer there in the communicate.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Don
you.
Russell from Deal Lake. Hello. You're muted, Don.
Got it. Okay. How you all doing today? I'd like to thank everyone for a fantastic summit here down at the Jersey Shore. You guys have been helping us out a lot. We had the grant commissioner in 2017, and your staff has been spectacular. You're helping us with the funding and the process, right? So it takes a long time. That was 2017. We'll hopefully be done by October with our project, and we invite you down to take a tour of the lake and see the Jersey Shore and Asbury Park area. But the overall, I'd like to also thank all my friends up at Lake Apac on Greenwood Lake. We kind of teamed up a while ago. I helped the DEP with some HAB work, and that friendship's a long way. It goes a long way. So I want to thank all my friends up there. And that's it. Have a great day and very interesting summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Well, thank you for that. And I'd be happy to come see the projects in play, and we'll be down in that area for our State of the Shore, and happy to take a look if that's a good time, or any other. But thank you all. Just to wrap up again, Kerry, for your steadfast service and commitment to so much of what we do beyond this. Katie, for your Herculean efforts to keep all of the pieces moving together in harmony, and being such a great facilitator of the science that is so critical. And thank you to everyone across our lake communities and that has gathered here today. We are fortunate to have such a robust conversation, and I look forward to it continuing in this space and many others. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conversations today.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for being here. And I remind everyone that we are going to take a break until 1 p.m. and you're welcome to exit the meeting, and please use the same link to return. And we'll see you all back here at 1 o'clock, where we continue our discussion on the science of HABs. Have a good lunch break.